Loretta, look at me. You don't have to serve anyone anymore.
Daniel, what are you doing? Everyone is watching.
They deserve to know who you really are.
But I'm just your housekeeper.
You're my wife.
Nobody in that room ever forgot the moment they realized who Loretta Combs really was. The chandeliers above them threw soft gold light across marble floors polished so bright they looked like still water, and champagne glasses caught that same light and scattered it across silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. Every person in that ballroom belonged to a world of old money and new empires, a world where names meant everything and where a woman in a plain gray dress carrying a silver tray was invisible by design. For 2 years, that had been Loretta's role in this house. She poured the wine. She refilled the trays. She disappeared into corners so the important people could talk about important things without noticing her at all. But on this particular night, every eye in that ballroom turned toward her at once, and for the first time in her life, Loretta Combs could not disappear. The host of the gala, a man most of Atlanta knew only from business magazines and hushed conversations about his fortune, crossed that marble floor with a purpose no one in the room had ever seen in him before. His name was Daniel Whitfield, and for 3 years he had been a ghost in his own life, a widower who showed up to events out of obligation and left before dessert was served. Tonight was different. Tonight he walked past senators and CEOs and old family friends without a single glance in their direction, his eyes locked only on the woman holding the serving tray near the far wall. The room fell into a silence so complete that the clink of ice in someone's glass sounded like thunder. He reached her, and without hesitation, without a flicker of doubt on his face, he took her hand in front of everyone who had ever underestimated her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Everyone, Daniel said, his voice steady enough to carry to every corner of that ballroom. I'd like you to meet my wife. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through a crowd that did not know how to react. Somewhere near the bar, a glass slipped from someone's fingers and shattered against the floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. Every guest in that room had spent the last 2 years walking past Loretta Combs as though she were part of the furniture, offering her nothing more than a nod or a muttered thank you when she refilled their drinks. Now they stood frozen, watching her hand tremble in Daniel's grip, watching a truth unfold that none of them had seen coming. Not even the ones who prided themselves on knowing everything about everyone in this city. Loretta stood there in her modest gray dress, the same dress she had worn to a dozen other events in this very house. Except tonight, it meant something entirely different. Her eyes searched the crowd, landing briefly on faces that had dismissed her, doubted her, and in one case, tried desperately to destroy her. She was not the same woman who had walked through the servants' entrance of this mansion 3 years earlier with nothing left to lose. She had earned this moment through heartbreak most of these guests would never understand, through sacrifices they would never have to make, and through a strength that had been tested in ways their comfortable lives had never demanded of them. And yet, even as pride swelled in her chest, a quieter feeling crept in alongside it. The awareness that this single sentence from Daniel had just changed everything, and not everyone in that room was going to accept it quietly. Because to understand how a woman who scrubbed floors for a living became the wife of one of the most powerful men in Atlanta, you have to go back 3 years, long before the chandeliers and the champagne, long before anyone in that ballroom knew her name. You have to go back to a rundown rental house on the edge of College Park, Georgia, where rain hammered against a roof with more holes than shingles, where a bucket sat in the hallway catching water that dripped steadily through a ceiling nobody could afford to fix. You have to go back to a woman standing in her kitchen at 4 in the morning, staring at a stack of unpaid bills under the dim light of a bulb that flickered every time the refrigerator kicked on, wondering how she was going to keep a roof, any roof, over her daughter's head for one more month. Her name was Loretta Combs, and on that particular Tuesday, She had absolutely nothing left to lose. Her husband had been gone for 2 years, taken from her and their daughter in an accident that should never have happened, an accident that left her raising a teenage girl alone on wages that barely covered groceries, let alone rent. She worked nights folding linens in a hospital laundry room, her hands raw from bleach and industrial detergent, and on weekends she cleaned other people's houses, scrubbing floors that were never hers to walk on comfortably. She had learned to swallow her pride a long time ago, because pride did not pay the electric bill, and pride certainly was not going to fix a roof that leaked every time a storm rolled through Georgia. What Loretta did not know, standing in that flickering kitchen light with rainwater dripping steadily into a plastic bucket, was that this particular storm was about to change the entire direction of her life, though not in any way she could have imagined that night. The morning after that storm, Loretta woke before the sun, the way she had every day since her husband passed. Her daughter, a bright and quietly resilient 16-year-old named Emily, was still asleep down the hall, unaware that her mother had already been up for an hour, mopping water off the kitchen floor and calculating, for the 10th time that week, exactly how far short they were on rent. Loretta moved through her small routine with the kind of practiced exhaustion that comes from years of holding a family together on almost nothing. She packed Emily's lunch with what little was left in the refrigerator, ironed her uniform for the hospital laundry shift, and left a note on the counter reminding her daughter to lock the door twice, a habit from a neighborhood where trust had to be earned rather than assumed. She left the house that morning carrying more weight than any person should have to carry alone, though nothing about her posture ever revealed it to the outside world. At the hospital, Loretta worked the kind of job most people never think about until they need clean sheets on a hospital bed. She stood for 10 hours at a time in a room thick with steam and bleach, her hands blistered from handling machines that ran hotter than they should have. Her co-workers respected her, mostly because she never complained, never gossiped, and never once asked for anything she had not already earned through effort. But respect did not pay overdue bills, and by the time her shift ended that Tuesday, she had already received 2 phone calls from her landlord, a man with little patience for hardship stories he had heard 100 times before. He informed her, without much warmth in his voice, that she was 3 months behind on rent and that eviction proceedings would begin if he did not see a payment within the week. Loretta stood in the hospital parking lot after that call, staring at her phone, feeling something inside her chest tighten in a way that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. That same week, Emily came home from school with her eyes red and her voice unusually quiet, the kind of silence Loretta had learned to recognize as trouble. It took nearly an hour of gentle prodding before her daughter finally admitted that a group of girls at school had mocked her for wearing the same 2 pairs of shoes all year, calling her family poor in front of half the cafeteria. Loretta held her daughter that night longer than usual, rocking her the way she had when Emily was small enough to fit entirely in her arms. And though she said all the right things about resilience and self-worth, inside she felt a shame so heavy it nearly broke her. She had built her entire life around protecting this child from exactly this kind of pain, and no matter how many extra shifts she picked up, no matter how many nights she went without dinner so Emily could eat more, the world kept finding new ways to remind her daughter that they had less than everyone around them. It was in the middle of that particular week, when the walls of Loretta's life felt like they were closing in from every direction, that a coworker mentioned a job opportunity that would change everything. A woman named Patricia, who cleaned houses on weekends for extra income, explained that one of her regular clients, an elderly housekeeper named Ruth who had worked for a wealthy family in Buckhead for over a decade, was finally retiring and needed someone reliable to take her place. The pay, Patricia said, was more than double what Loretta made cleaning other houses, and the family, though private and somewhat reclusive, paid on time and treated their staff with a level of respect not common in that world. Loretta hesitated at first, unfamiliar with the idea of working inside a mansion, uncertain whether she would even be considered given her lack of formal references. But desperation has a way of quieting doubt, and by the end of that conversation, she had asked Patricia for the contact information, understanding that this single opportunity might be the only thing standing between her family and losing the roof over their heads entirely. The interview took place on a Thursday afternoon, at the end of a long private driveway lined with manicured hedges that Loretta had only ever seen in magazines. The house itself rose in front of her like something from another world entirely, all stone and glass and quiet grandeur, the kind of home built not just for living, but for reminding everyone who saw it exactly how much distance existed between the people inside and the rest of the world. Loretta smoothed down her best blouse, the only one without a visible stain, and walked up to the front entrance with her heart pounding harder than she wanted to admit. She was greeted not by the homeowner himself, but by his assistant, a sharp and efficient woman who walked her through the expectations of the role with clinical precision, barely making eye contact throughout the conversation. It was made clear, without being said outright, that the man of the house rarely interacted with staff at all, that he preferred his home to run quietly and efficiently around him, almost as if he wished to remain invisible within his own life. His name, the assistant finally mentioned near the end of their conversation, was Daniel Whitfield, and though Loretta had never met him personally, she had heard his name mentioned on the local news more than once, usually in connection with real estate developments transforming entire neighborhoods across Atlanta. What the assistant did not mention, though Loretta would learn it soon enough from the quiet, careful way the household staff spoke around certain rooms, was that Daniel Whitfield had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier, and that grief had settled into that enormous house like a permanent resident, filling every hallway with a silence far heavier than mere emptiness. Loretta accepted the position that same afternoon, relieved beyond words at the thought of a steady paycheck large enough to save her family from eviction, though she had no idea, standing in that grand foyer for the first time, just how deeply her life was about to intertwine with the broken, guarded heart of the man who owned it. Loretta's first official day inside the Whitfield mansion began before dawn, the same way every working day of her life had begun for as long as she could remember. She arrived nearly 20 minutes early, unwilling to give anyone a single reason to question her reliability, and stood at the service entrance until a member of the household staff finally let her inside. The kitchen alone was larger than her entire rental house, filled with equipment she had only ever seen on television, and for a brief moment, standing in the middle of that gleaming space, Loretta felt a wave of intimidation she quickly forced herself to push down. She had not come this far, endured this much, to be paralyzed by marble countertops and imported appliances. She reminded herself, the same way she reminded herself every difficult morning, that this job was not about comfort or belonging. It was about survival, about keeping a roof over her daughter's head, and that clarity settled her nerves enough to begin her first task. The household staff, though initially cautious with a newcomer, warmed to Loretta quickly once they saw how carefully she worked and how little she complained. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the rhythms and unspoken rules of a house that clearly operated around one central truth, that its owner preferred to be left alone. The staff spoke of Daniel Whitfield the way people speak of weather patterns, something to be worked around rather than engaged with directly. He kept to his private study for most of the day, emerged briefly for meals he barely touched, and retreated again without much conversation. Loretta noticed the coat still hanging by the back door, a woman's coat, clearly untouched for years, the kind of detail that told her far more about this house than any of the staff had said aloud. Grief, she understood better than most, did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply hung quietly by a door, waiting. It was nearly a week before Loretta encountered Daniel Whitfield directly, and even then, the meeting happened almost by accident. She had been asked to bring tea to his study, a task usually handled by another staff member who had called in sick that afternoon. Loretta knocked once, received no answer, and entered cautiously, finding him seated behind a large desk, staring at a photograph rather than the paperwork spread out in front of him. He looked up sharply, clearly unaccustomed to interruptions, and studied her with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between irritation and exhaustion. Loretta did not shrink under his gaze the way some might have expected. She had buried a husband, raised a daughter alone through hardship most people never faced, and a wealthy man's cold stare, however unsettling, did not frighten her the way it might have frightened someone with less behind them. She simply set the tea down and turned to leave. "Wait," Daniel said, his voice rougher than she expected, as though it had not been used in genuine conversation for quite some time. Loretta paused near the doorway, unsure what to expect next, watching as he glanced down at the tea she had prepared with an expression that shifted from mild confusion to something far more complicated. She had made it a particular way, with a touch of honey and a slice of lemon set on the side rather than squeezed directly into the cup, a small detail she had noticed in an old photograph resting on a side table in the hallway, one showing a woman laughing with a teacup in her hand. Loretta had not thought much of it at the time, simply mimicking a detail she assumed reflected the household's preference. She had no way of knowing that this exact preparation had belonged specifically to his late wife, a private ritual known only to the two of them, one none of the other staff had ever replicated. Daniel stared at the tea for a long moment before finally looking back up at Loretta, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes had visibly shifted. "Who taught you to make it like this?" he asked, his tone quieter now, almost cautious, as though he were afraid of the answer. Loretta explained honestly that she had simply noticed a photograph in the hallway and guessed, admitting she meant nothing more by it than an attempt to do her job well. Daniel said nothing further, simply nodding once before returning his attention to the paperwork on his desk, though Loretta could sense, even as she left the room, that something about that small, accidental gesture had unsettled him in a way far deeper than she understood. She did not know, walking back toward the kitchen that afternoon, that she had just done something no one else in that house had managed to do in 3 long years. She had reminded Daniel Whitfield, however briefly, of what it felt like to be seen and cared for again. Weeks passed inside the Whitfield mansion, and though Daniel remained a man of few words, something between him and Loretta had quietly begun to shift. He started emerging from his study a little earlier each evening, lingering near the kitchen under the thin excuse of needing more coffee, though Loretta suspected, without ever saying so, that he simply wanted the sound of another voice in a house that had swallowed silence for far too long. She never pushed him to talk. She had learned long ago that grief could not be rushed or coaxed out of someone before they were ready, and so she simply continued doing her work with quiet consistency, answering his occasional questions honestly, without the practiced flattery some employees offered wealthy employers hoping to be noticed. It was precisely that honesty, blunt and unpolished, that Daniel found himself unexpectedly drawn to, though he could not yet explain why it mattered as much as it did. One evening, as autumn settled over Atlanta and the air outside turned crisp enough to require a jacket, Daniel found himself asking Loretta about her daughter, a question that surprised even him as it left his mouth. Loretta hesitated only briefly before answering, describing Emily's sharp mind and her love of reading, careful not to mention the hardships that came with raising a teenager on a single income. Daniel listened more intently than she expected, occasionally asking follow-up questions that revealed a genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. For the first time since she had started working in that house, Loretta allowed herself to relax slightly in his presence, sensing that whatever wall existed between employer and employee had begun, however slowly, to soften into something closer to mutual respect. It was during this same period that Loretta received a phone call at work that made her stomach drop, her landlord informing her that the recent storm had caused significant additional damage to her roof, and that repairs would cost far more than she had anticipated, money she simply did not have. She said nothing about it at the mansion, unwilling to burden her employer with problems that were not his responsibility, and instead spent that evening quietly calculating which bills she could delay and which she absolutely could not. What Loretta did not know was that Daniel's assistant, following a routine background and reference check required for all household staff, had come across details of Loretta's rental situation, including the outstanding repair notice from her landlord, information that eventually made its way to Daniel himself, though not through any effort of Loretta's own. Nearly 2 weeks later, Loretta received a call from her landlord that left her stunned into silence, informing her that her account had been paid in full, including the emergency roof repair, and that a contractor would be arriving within the week to complete the work. Confused and slightly panicked, assuming some kind of mistake had occurred, Loretta contacted her landlord directly, only to be told that payment had come through a private transaction, the source of which he was not authorized to disclose. It took her several days of quiet reflection, replaying recent conversations and small gestures, before she began to suspect the truth, though she said nothing to Daniel directly, unsure how to address something so enormous without risking the fragile professional boundary she had worked so hard to maintain. The confirmation came almost by accident, during a quiet evening when Loretta found a folder left carelessly on the study desk while delivering tea, containing a receipt from the same roofing company that had repaired her home. She stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the paper in her hands, overwhelmed by a gratitude so intense it nearly brought her to tears right there in his study. When Daniel entered the room moments later and saw the folder in her hands, he did not deny what he had done, nor did he offer any grand explanation, simply stating quietly that no one should have to choose between keeping their family safe and keeping a roof over their heads. Loretta struggled to find words adequate enough to thank him, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke, and for the first time since they had met, Daniel offered her something resembling a genuine smile, small and imperfect, but real. Neither of them fully understood it yet, but something had shifted permanently between them that evening, something neither grief nor circumstance would be able to undo. The arrival of Cynthia Whitfield Rourke into the quiet rhythm of that household felt, to everyone who worked there, like a sudden drop in temperature. She was Daniel's older sister, a woman whose entire presence seemed engineered to remind others of the vast distance between her world and theirs. She swept through the front doors that afternoon wrapped in a fur-trimmed coat despite the mild Georgia weather, her heels striking the marble floor with a sharp, deliberate rhythm that echoed through the foyer long before she ever spoke a word. The household staff, who had grown accustomed to the quiet, almost gentle atmosphere Loretta's presence had helped restore, immediately tensed at the sound of her arrival, exchanging brief, knowing glances that said more than words ever could. Cynthia had a reputation, one whispered about carefully among the staff, of treating anyone she considered beneath her with a coldness bordering on cruelty, and today would prove to be no exception. Loretta was polishing silverware in the dining room when Cynthia entered without so much as a greeting, her eyes sweeping over the space with open scrutiny before finally landing on Loretta herself. "You must be the new housekeeper," Cynthia said, her tone carrying the kind of politeness that somehow managed to feel more insulting than outright hostility. Loretta offered a respectful nod, introducing herself calmly, though she immediately sensed something calculating behind Cynthia's carefully composed smile. Cynthia's gaze lingered a moment too long on Loretta's simple uniform, on her hands still damp from cleaning, before she turned away entirely, addressing the room as though Loretta had already ceased to exist within it. It was a small moment, easily dismissed by anyone who had not spent years learning to recognize condescension in its quietest forms, but Loretta recognized it instantly, filing it away without comment, understanding intuitively that this woman viewed her as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Over the following days, Cynthia's visits to the mansion became more frequent, each one accompanied by a growing tension that even Daniel seemed to notice, though he rarely addressed it directly. She would arrive unannounced, rearranging household schedules without consulting the staff, criticizing small details of Loretta's work with a precision that suggested she was searching for reasons to complain rather than genuinely concerned with household standards. Loretta remained professional throughout, refusing to give Cynthia the satisfaction of a reaction, though the effort required to maintain that composure grew heavier with each visit. What Loretta did not yet understand was that Cynthia's sudden interest in the household had little to do with cleanliness or standards at all, and everything to do with the quiet, unmistakable shift she had noticed in her brother's demeanor, a warmth Daniel had not shown toward anyone since his wife's death, a warmth that Cynthia viewed not with relief, but with alarm. Alongside Cynthia's growing presence came Preston Doyle, Daniel's longtime business partner, a man whose easy charm masked a far more calculating nature beneath the surface. Preston had built much of his influence within Whitfield Enterprises on Daniel's continued isolation, his grief-driven detachment from personal matters allowing Preston significant control over decisions that, under normal circumstances, Daniel would have scrutinized far more carefully. The idea of Daniel forming a genuine emotional attachment, particularly to someone with no financial or social standing to protect his interests, represented a direct threat to the comfortable arrangement Preston had quietly built over the past several years. Though Preston never said as much outright, his interactions with Loretta carried a subtle undercurrent of suspicion, his questions about her background just probing enough to suggest he was gathering information rather than engaging in polite conversation. It was during a particularly tense dinner, one Cynthia had insisted on attending under the pretense of discussing family matters, that the first real confrontation occurred. Cynthia, noticing an antique bracelet missing from a display case in the upstairs hallway, immediately suggested, in front of the entire household staff, that Loretta be questioned about its disappearance. The accusation landed like a slap, sudden and deliberate, silencing the room instantly. Loretta felt her pulse quicken, humiliation and anger rising together as every eye in that dining room turned toward her, waiting to see how she would respond to an accusation she instinctively understood was not simply a misunderstanding, but something far more calculated, something designed specifically to remind her exactly where Cynthia believed she belonged. The silence that followed Cynthia's accusation stretched long enough for Loretta to feel every second of it pressing against her chest. She stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her apron, refusing to let her expression betray the storm building underneath her composure. She had faced hardship before, faced people who looked down on her circumstances, but never had she been accused so directly, so publicly, of something that struck at the very core of her integrity. Loretta had spent her entire life building a reputation for honesty, often the only currency available to someone with little else to offer, and to have that reputation questioned in front of an entire household felt like watching years of quiet dignity threaten to unravel in a single moment. Daniel, seated at the head of the table, did not respond immediately, and that brief hesitation, lasting perhaps only 3 or 4 seconds, felt to Loretta like an eternity. She watched his eyes shift between his sister and herself, watched something flicker across his face that looked uncomfortably close to uncertainty, and in that moment, a quiet devastation settled over her that had nothing to do with the accusation itself. She had begun, however cautiously, to trust this man, to believe that the respect he had shown her these past weeks meant something real. His hesitation, however brief, reminded her sharply of a truth she had perhaps allowed herself to forget, that no matter how many kind gestures passed between them, she remained, in the eyes of this world, replaceable, someone whose word could still be questioned before it was believed. It was Daniel's assistant, standing quietly near the doorway, who finally broke the tension, mentioning almost hesitantly that the security cameras installed throughout the house, including the upstairs hallway, would have captured footage from earlier that day. The suggestion visibly startled Cynthia, a flicker of something sharp and uneasy crossing her expression before she quickly composed herself, insisting the footage would surely confirm her suspicions. Daniel, seemingly grateful for a path forward that did not require an immediate judgment call, requested the footage be reviewed immediately, his tone carrying an authority that finally, belatedly, restored some sense of fairness to the room. Loretta remained standing throughout the tense 15 minutes that followed, refusing to sit, refusing to appear as though she had anything to hide, though inside, her heart pounded with a mixture of anger and fear she had not felt in years. The footage, once reviewed, told a story entirely different from the one Cynthia had presented. It clearly showed a household staff member, one who had only recently been hired, and who had grown noticeably close to Cynthia over the past several weeks, entering the upstairs hallway alone earlier that afternoon, opening the display case, and slipping the bracelet into her own pocket before placing it, moments later, inside a bag belonging to Loretta while she was occupied elsewhere in the house. The room fell into stunned silence as the truth became undeniable, every eye shifting first toward the accused staff member, who immediately broke down under the weight of exposure, and then slowly, uncomfortably, toward Cynthia herself, whose carefully composed expression cracked just enough to reveal something far more calculated than concern over a missing bracelet. Daniel dismissed the staff member immediately, his voice sharp with a controlled anger Loretta had not heard from him before, though his gaze lingered pointedly on his sister as he did so, making clear, without stating it outright, that he understood exactly whose influence had orchestrated the entire situation. Cynthia offered no apology, simply gathering her coat and leaving the room with the same sharp, deliberate footsteps that had announced her arrival, though the confidence behind them felt noticeably diminished. Daniel turned to Loretta once the room had emptied, offering a quiet, sincere apology for his hesitation, admitting honestly that his instinct to protect his family, however misguided in that moment, had briefly clouded his judgment. Loretta accepted his apology graciously, though privately, she understood that something fragile between them had been tested that night, a fracture that trust alone, however genuine, would take considerable time to fully repair. The weeks following the incident with the bracelet brought a quiet, careful healing to the relationship between Daniel and Loretta, though neither of them spoke openly about what had shifted. Daniel made a visible effort to include her in small, ordinary moments, asking her opinion on household matters that had nothing to do with cleaning, lingering at the kitchen table over coffee in a way that had become less about avoiding an empty study and more about genuinely wanting her company. Loretta, though still cautious after the sting of his earlier hesitation, found herself slowly lowering the walls she had built over years of disappointment, allowing herself small moments of laughter, small moments of forgetting the weight she usually carried. It was during this fragile, hopeful stretch of time that the phone call came, late on a Thursday evening, the kind of call every parent dreads receiving. Loretta was finishing the dinner dishes when her phone rang, the school's emergency line flashing across the screen, and within seconds she learned that Emily had been involved in a car accident on her way home from a study group, the details still unclear beyond the fact that she had been rushed to the hospital. Loretta's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone, every rational thought dissolving into raw, primal fear as she tried to remember how to breathe, how to move, how to get to her daughter as quickly as possible. Daniel, who had been in the next room and heard the sudden change in her voice, appeared in the doorway within seconds, immediately understanding the severity of the situation without needing a full explanation. Without hesitation, without a single question about logistics or timing, He grabbed his keys and told her he was driving her to the hospital himself. The drive across Atlanta felt endless. Loretta staring blankly out the window, repeating quiet, desperate prayers under her breath, while Daniel remained silent beside her, occasionally reaching over to steady her trembling hands without offering empty reassurances he could not guarantee. When they arrived at the hospital, Daniel did not simply drop her at the entrance and wait outside. He parked the car himself and walked in beside her, standing firmly at her side as she approached the front desk, too shaken to fully articulate her daughter's name. It was Daniel who spoke calmly to the nurses, who used his influence to ensure Emily was seen by the hospital's best specialists without delay, though he never once made Loretta feel as though his help came with any expectation of gratitude or obligation. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of waiting room chairs, quiet hallway conversations, and the constant, aching fear that accompanies not knowing whether your child will be all right. Daniel remained beside Loretta the entire night, never once suggesting he had somewhere else to be, never once treating her pain as something separate from his own concern. At one point, exhausted and overwhelmed, Loretta broke down entirely, her composure finally shattering under the weight of years of quiet struggle culminating in this single, terrifying night, and Daniel, without hesitation, simply held her, allowing her grief and fear to exist without judgment, without needing to be fixed immediately. It was, in its own quiet way, the most intimate moment they had shared since she had entered his life. Two people who understood loss far too intimately, holding on to each other in a hospital hallway at 3 a.m. By the time a doctor finally emerged to explain that Emily would make a full recovery, suffering only a broken arm and minor lacerations despite the severity of the accident, Loretta felt a relief so overwhelming it nearly buckled her knees entirely. She turned to Daniel, tears streaming freely down her face, and thanked him with a sincerity that went far beyond politeness, though he simply shook his head, insisting there was nothing to thank him for, that he had done nothing more than what anyone who cared about her would have done. It was in that exact moment, standing in a sterile hospital hallway at nearly 4 a.m, exhausted and emotionally raw, that both of them silently acknowledged, without ever saying the words aloud, that whatever existed between them had grown into something far deeper than employer and employee, something neither of them had expected, but neither of them wanted to walk away from either. While Loretta and Daniel's bond deepened in the aftermath of Emily's accident, Preston Doyle watched the growing closeness between them with a rising sense of unease that had little to do with sentiment and everything to do with self-preservation. Preston had spent years positioning himself as indispensable to Daniel, quietly consolidating influence over decisions Daniel no longer had the emotional bandwidth to scrutinize closely. A grieving, distracted Daniel had been easy to manage. A Daniel who was healing, who was beginning to trust someone outside the carefully controlled circle Preston had built around him, represented a threat to an arrangement that had served Preston very well for a very long time. He began asking quiet questions about Loretta among the household staff, framing his curiosity as simple due diligence, though those who knew him best recognized the sharper motive underneath his practiced charm. It did not take Preston long to trace Loretta's background through public records, beginning with her late husband's name and the circumstances surrounding his death. What he found stopped him cold. Loretta's husband had died several years earlier in a construction accident at a site owned by a subsidiary company under the Whitfield Enterprises umbrella, a company Preston himself had helped structure specifically to shield the parent organization from liability in situations exactly like this one. The insurance claim filed on behalf of Loretta's husband had been denied, the paperwork citing safety violations that, according to the records Preston now reviewed with mounting discomfort, had been buried rather than corrected at the time. He recognized his own signature on several of those internal documents, a detail he had assumed was long forgotten, filed away in the same quiet manner as dozens of other inconvenient details from that period of rapid expansion. Preston sat alone in his office for a long while that evening, staring at the documents spread across his desk, weighing the danger this discovery represented against the opportunity it might also provide. If Loretta ever learned the truth, ever connected her husband's death to a company Daniel now controlled entirely, the fragile trust she had built with him could collapse instantly, regardless of how much distance existed between Daniel's current leadership and the decisions made years earlier under different circumstances. Preston understood that the truth, handled carefully, might not need to destroy anyone but Loretta's trust in Daniel himself. It could be used, quietly and precisely, to widen the very distance Preston needed restored between them, without ever exposing his own role in the original cover-up. He began, that same night, planning exactly how and when that information should surface. Meanwhile, unaware of the storm quietly forming around her, Loretta continued settling into a version of life she had not believed herself capable of imagining. Daniel had begun speaking openly about his late wife, sharing memories he had kept locked away for years, memories that revealed not just his grief, but the man he had been before loss reshaped him so completely. Loretta, in turn, found herself speaking more freely about her husband, about the quiet, steady love they had shared before it was taken from her, conversations that felt less like burdens shared and more like healing finally allowed to breathe. Neither of them realized that the very tragedy connecting their pasts, hers through loss, his through the company bearing his family's name, was about to resurface in a way that would test everything they had carefully, painfully built together. It was Emily, home from school one afternoon and searching for old family documents to complete a class project on her father's life, who stumbled upon a folder of paperwork Loretta had kept tucked away for years, paperwork she had never fully understood, related to her father's accident and the insurance claim that had been denied. Emily, curious and increasingly aware of the world around her, noticed the name of the subsidiary company listed on the documents, a name she recognized immediately from conversations overheard in the Whitfield household. She said nothing to her mother that evening, uncertain of what the connection meant, but the unsettled feeling in her stomach told her, with the instinct only a child protecting a parent can possess, that this discovery mattered far more than she currently understood. Emily carried the weight of that discovery for nearly a week before finally working up the courage to show her mother the folder she had found. She waited until a quiet evening when Loretta seemed unusually relaxed, curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, before gently placing the documents in front of her and admitting where she had found them. Loretta's expression shifted the moment she recognized the paperwork, old grief rising immediately to the surface, though it took her a moment longer to notice what Emily had already circled in pencil, the name of the subsidiary company responsible for her husband's accident. She stared at that name for a long time, her mind slowly connecting details she had never thought to question before, details that now formed a picture too disturbing to ignore. Loretta spent that night awake long after Emily had gone to sleep, spreading the old documents across her kitchen table, cross-referencing names and dates with information she now recalled from casual conversations inside the Whitfield mansion. The subsidiary company listed on her husband's denied insurance claim had, years later, been fully absorbed into Whitfield Enterprises during a period of expansion Daniel himself had personally overseen. It did not matter, in that raw, sleepless moment, that Daniel had not been the one to deny the original claim, that the decision had been made under leadership that existed years before he took full control. All Loretta could see was the devastating truth that the very empire she had grown to trust, the very family she had allowed herself to fall in love with, was directly connected to the tragedy that had shattered her family in the first place. The following afternoon, Loretta requested a private conversation with Daniel, her voice steady despite the storm raging beneath her composure. She placed the documents in front of him without preamble, watching his expression shift from confusion to disbelief as he began piecing together exactly what she was showing him. Daniel read through the paperwork carefully, his hands noticeably tightening around the pages as the full weight of the connection became clear. His own family's company indirectly responsible for the death of the man Loretta had loved, the father of the child he had grown to care for deeply himself. He looked up at her, his face pale, his voice barely above a whisper as he admitted he had no memory of this specific case, that decisions made at the subsidiary level years earlier would not have crossed his desk directly, though he understood immediately why that explanation offered Loretta little comfort in that moment. "I need you to understand something," Daniel said carefully, his voice thick with an emotion Loretta had never heard from him before, something closer to shame than defensiveness. He explained, as gently as he could, that he had inherited a company built on decisions made long before he assumed full leadership, decisions he was still, even now, uncovering and correcting as he found them. But Loretta, overwhelmed by grief resurfacing after years of careful suppression, could not separate the company from the man standing in front of her, could not reconcile the tenderness she had come to feel for him with the sudden, sharp awareness that his family's negligence had stolen her husband's life and left her raising a child alone in poverty for years afterward. The two truths existed simultaneously, both undeniable, both devastating, and Loretta felt herself splitting apart under the impossible weight of holding them together. "I can't do this," Loretta finally said, her voice breaking as she gathered the documents back into their folder, refusing to meet Daniel's eyes as tears blurred her vision. She loved him, she realized in that very moment, loved him with a depth that terrified her precisely because of how quickly and completely it had happened. But loving him now felt inseparable from betraying the memory of the man she had lost, and betraying her own daughter, who had grown up without a father because of choices made within the very walls of the empire Daniel now controlled. Daniel reached for her, desperation clear in his voice as he begged her to stay, to let him make this right somehow. But Loretta was already moving toward the door, overwhelmed and unable to think clearly enough to accept comfort from the very source of her pain. She left that evening without another word, leaving Daniel standing alone in his study, staring at the closed door, the silence of that enormous house pressing down on him more heavily than it ever had before. Loretta did not return to work at the Whitfield mansion the following morning, nor the morning after that, choosing instead to retreat into the familiar walls of her mother's small house on the outskirts of town, a place she had not called home in years, but which now felt like the only space where she could breathe without the weight of everything unfolding around her. Her mother, a woman of quiet wisdom shaped by her own decades of hardship, did not press Loretta for details right away, simply making space for her daughter's grief the way she had done so many times before. It was only after several days of watching Loretta move through the house like a ghost, barely eating, barely speaking, that her mother finally sat her down and asked her plainly what had happened, insisting that whatever it was deserved more than silent suffering. Loretta explained everything that evening, the documents, the subsidiary company, the devastating realization that had sent her running from the one place she had finally begun to feel safe. Her mother listened carefully, asking few questions, though when Loretta finished, she offered a piece of insight that lodged itself firmly in her daughter's mind. She reminded Loretta that companies as large as Whitfield Enterprises rarely operated as a single unified will, that decisions made at lower levels, particularly during periods of aggressive expansion, often happened far outside the awareness of the very executives whose names appeared on the letterhead. It was not an excuse, her mother said carefully, but it was a distinction worth understanding fully before allowing grief to close a door that genuine love might still be standing behind. That conversation planted a seed of doubt in Loretta's mind, not about the tragedy itself, but about her own assumption that Daniel bore direct responsibility for a decision made years before he held real power within the company. Unable to simply let the matter rest, and unwilling to return to Daniel until she understood the full truth for herself, Loretta began quietly researching the subsidiary company on her own, using the same determined persistence that had carried her through every other hardship in her life. She spent hours at the local library, cross-referencing old news archives, court filings, and business registration records, slowly piecing together a timeline of exactly who had controlled that subsidiary at the time of her husband's accident, and who specifically had signed off on the safety inspections that had, according to official records, cleared the site as compliant despite conditions that clearly were not. What Loretta discovered stopped her cold. The signature authorizing those falsified safety records did not belong to Daniel, nor to anyone directly connected to his side of the family's leadership at the time. It belonged to Preston Doyle, listed not as a business partner, but as the acting safety compliance officer for the subsidiary during that specific period, a role he had apparently held briefly before transitioning into the broader executive position he occupied now. Loretta stared at that name for a long time, memories suddenly rearranging themselves into a far more disturbing pattern. Preston's unusually probing questions about her background, his subtle discomfort whenever her late husband's name came up in passing conversation, details she had dismissed at the time as simple awkwardness now revealing themselves as something far more calculated. Loretta drove back to the Whitfield mansion that same evening, documents in hand, her earlier heartbreak now tangled with a fierce, protective anger she had not felt in years. She found Daniel exactly where she expected, alone in his study, looking as though he had not slept properly since the night she left. He rose the moment she entered, relief and confusion crossing his face in equal measure, but Loretta did not give him time to speak first. She placed the newly gathered documents on his desk, watching his expression shift from cautious hope to genuine shock as he read through the evidence connecting Preston directly to the falsified safety records. "It wasn't you," Loretta said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she had carried these past several days. "It was never you. It was him." Daniel sat in stunned silence for several long moments after reading through the documents Loretta had gathered, his mind working backward through years of decisions, meetings, and quiet assurances Preston had offered him during the most vulnerable period of his life. He thought of every instance Preston had steered him away from reviewing older subsidiary records, every casual dismissal of due diligence dressed up as protecting Daniel's time and energy during his grief. What had once looked like loyalty now revealed itself as something far more calculated, a decade of careful positioning designed to keep Daniel exactly where Preston needed him, distracted, trusting, and unwilling to look too closely at the foundations beneath his own company. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, the betrayal settling into his chest like a stone, before rising from his desk with a quiet, controlled fury Loretta had never witnessed in him before. He called an emergency board meeting for the following morning, giving no explanation beyond the words urgent and confidential, though those close enough to Daniel could hear something different in his voice, a steadiness that suggested this was not a routine matter. Preston arrived at that meeting expecting the usual dynamic between them, arriving 15 minutes late as he often did, confident in the years of trust he believed insulated him from any real scrutiny. That confidence lasted only until Daniel placed the falsified safety documents on the table in front of the entire board, watching closely as the color drained from Preston's face in real time. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply laid out the timeline calmly, methodically, allowing the documents themselves to speak louder than any accusation he could have made personally. Preston attempted, at first, to deflect responsibility, suggesting the records could have been altered or misinterpreted, that decisions made years earlier under different corporate structures should not be judged by today's standards. But Daniel had anticipated this response, producing additional records Loretta had uncovered during her own research, records that showed a pattern of similar safety violations buried across multiple subsidiary sites during Preston's tenure as compliance officer, each one resulting in preventable accidents that had never been properly investigated or compensated. The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence as board members who had trusted Preston for years began to fully absorb the scope of what they were seeing, several exchanging glances that made clear his position within the company had just become untenable. It was Cynthia's sudden appearance at the meeting, uninvited and clearly unsettled, that shifted the situation even further. She had learned only that morning that Preston intended to implicate her involvement in the earlier bracelet incident should the safety record scandal threaten to expose their broader financial arrangement, a partnership built on mutual convenience rather than any real loyalty. Rather than risk being dragged down alongside him, Cynthia made a calculated decision to protect herself, revealing to the board, in front of everyone present, that Preston had specifically orchestrated the false theft accusation against Loretta months earlier, hoping to destabilize her growing relationship with Daniel before the safety record issue could ever surface. Her confession, though self-serving, effectively confirmed every suspicion Daniel and Loretta had begun to piece together, exposing Preston's manipulation as far more extensive and deliberate than either of them had initially realized. The fallout arrived swiftly. Preston was removed from his position within Whitfield Enterprises before the board meeting even concluded. The falsified safety records immediately forwarded to state regulatory authorities for formal investigation, opening the door to potential criminal charges related to negligence and fraud spanning multiple years and multiple victims beyond Loretta's own family. News of the scandal spread quickly through Atlanta's business circles, though Daniel made no attempt to minimize or control the story, insisting instead that full transparency was the only acceptable path forward, regardless of the damage it might cause to the company's public image in the short term. For Loretta, watching justice finally catch up to a man who had caused so much quiet suffering, the relief she felt was tempered by an old, familiar grief resurfacing, the reminder that no amount of accountability could ever truly return what she had lost all those years ago. In the weeks that followed Preston's public exposure, Daniel threw himself into a task he considered far more important than protecting his company's reputation, personally reviewing every case connected to the falsified safety records uncovered during the investigation. He discovered, with a growing and painful clarity, that Loretta's husband had not been the only life lost to Preston's negligence, that at least 4 other families across various subsidiary construction sites had suffered similar losses, each one denied fair compensation through the same pattern of buried inspection reports and dismissed claims. Daniel met personally with every affected family, refusing to delegate the responsibility to lawyers or public relations representatives, understanding instinctively that these families deserved more than a corporate apology delivered at arm's length. He listened to their stories, absorbed their pain without flinching from it, and authorized full compensation for each family, along with a formal, public acknowledgement of the company's failure to protect the workers who had built its success. It was during this period of accountability that Daniel decided to establish a foundation in his late wife's memory, one dedicated specifically to supporting families who had lost providers to workplace accidents, offering not just financial assistance, but educational scholarships, counseling resources, and career training designed to help surviving spouses rebuild their lives with dignity rather than charity alone. He named the foundation carefully, choosing words that honored both his late wife's compassion and the resilience he had witnessed so powerfully in Loretta over the past several months. Though Loretta had not yet returned his calls, Daniel made sure she learned of the foundation's creation, not as a grand gesture meant to win her back, but as genuine proof that her pain, and the pain of families like hers, had permanently changed the way he intended to lead his company moving forward. Loretta, still staying at her mother's house, received word of the foundation through a quiet phone call from Daniel's assistant, who explained the initiative without any pressure or expectation attached. She sat with that information for several days, turning it over in her mind alongside everything else that had happened, slowly allowing herself to separate the man she had come to love from the tragedy that had once seemed inseparable from his name. Emily, healed from her accident and increasingly perceptive for someone her age, noticed her mother's quiet distraction and finally asked her directly whether she still loved Daniel, a question Loretta found herself unable to answer with anything less than complete honesty. She admitted, for the first time out loud, that she did, deeply and without reservation, but that fear of further heartbreak had kept her from reaching out again. It was raining the evening Daniel finally drove out to Loretta's mother's house himself, refusing to send a message or a representative, insisting on facing her directly regardless of how she might respond. He stood at the front door for a long moment before knocking, rehearsing words that felt inadequate no matter how many times he rearranged them in his mind. The sound of rain against the porch roof echoing uncomfortably the storm that had first brought Loretta into his life years earlier. When Loretta opened the door and saw him standing there, soaked through his coat, his expression raw and unguarded in a way she had never witnessed from him before, something inside her chest finally loosened after weeks of carefully guarded distance. Neither of them spoke right away, the weight of everything that had happened settling comfortably into the silence between them rather than forcing it apart. Daniel finally admitted that he had spent every day since she left trying to become someone worthy of the trust she had once given him so freely, not to earn her forgiveness through grand gestures, but because confronting the truth of his company's failures had fundamentally changed how he understood his own responsibility to the people around him. Loretta, tears mixing freely with the rain still clinging to her face, stepped forward and pulled him into an embrace that said far more than words could have managed in that moment, both of them finally allowing themselves to believe, cautiously and completely, that whatever they had built together was strong enough to survive even the most painful truths standing between them. The gala that would change everything for Loretta Combs took place nearly 6 months after that rain-soaked reunion on her mother's porch, hosted at the very mansion where she had once entered quietly through a service entrance, carrying nothing but exhaustion and a desperate hope for steady wages. This time, she arrived through the front doors, though she had insisted, even now, on wearing something simple rather than extravagant, a modest gray dress that felt more honest to who she truly was than any of the designer gowns Daniel had gently offered to provide. Atlanta's wealthiest families filled that marble foyer once again, drawn by curiosity as much as tradition, having heard whispers throughout the city about Daniel Whitfield's sudden and unexplained decision to host a gala after years of quiet reclusiveness following his first wife's passing. Loretta moved through the early part of that evening exactly as she had months before, quietly helping the household staff with final preparations, a habit she had never fully abandoned despite Daniel's repeated insistence that she no longer needed to lift a single tray in that house again. It was, in its own way, a quiet act of defiance and identity, a refusal to let wealth erase the woman who had fought so hard to survive long before any of this had entered her life. She recognized several faces scattered throughout the crowd, guests who had once looked through her as though she were invisible, murmuring polite nothings while she refilled their glasses, entirely unaware of the strength quietly standing among them all along. Daniel found her near the edge of the ballroom exactly as the evening reached its peak, taking her hand with a steadiness that revealed none of the nervous uncertainty he privately admitted feeling earlier that day. He led her gently toward the center of the room, and as conversation gradually quieted around them, sensing something significant unfolding, Daniel spoke the words that would ripple through Atlanta's social circles for months to come, introducing Loretta not as his housekeeper, not as a rumor whispered behind closed doors, but as his wife, standing proudly beside him in front of everyone who had once underestimated her. The reaction in that room was immediate and layered, disbelief mixing openly with quiet admiration among those who had witnessed, even briefly, the transformation both Daniel and Loretta had undergone over the past several months. Cynthia, present that evening despite the fractured trust between siblings, offered a stiff but genuine nod of acknowledgement toward Loretta, a small gesture that spoke volumes given everything that had transpired between them. Emily stood nearby, radiant and proud, watching her mother finally receive recognition for a strength she had witnessed privately for years, long before the rest of the world had any idea who Loretta Combs truly was. Daniel raised his glass that evening, addressing the room with a clarity and conviction that silenced any remaining doubt among the guests gathered before him. He spoke not of Loretta's transformation from housekeeper to wife, refusing to reduce her story to a fairy tale narrative built around his own wealth and status. Instead, he spoke of her resilience, her unwavering integrity in the face of hardship most of the people in that room would never fully understand, and her quiet, powerful capacity to love fully even after loss had taken so much from her. He credited her, honestly and without exaggeration, for reminding him what it meant to truly live again after years spent merely existing within the walls of his own grief. As the evening drew to a close, Loretta stood at the center of that grand ballroom, surrounded by wealth and status she had never sought for herself, understanding fully now that her true victory had never been about status at all. It had been about survival, about protecting her daughter through impossible circumstances, about refusing to let hardship erase her dignity, and about allowing herself, finally, to be loved fully and completely by someone who saw her worth long before the rest of the world ever did. Nobody in that room would ever look at Loretta Combs the same way again, not because she had become someone new, but because they had finally been forced to see the remarkable woman who had been standing quietly among them all along.